was known for writing books about food. I'd written several books about food and agriculture and diet, and so I didn't know if how people were going to accept this kind of right-angle change in subject matter. Although in my own head, there was some continuity, but I've been pleasantly surprised. I mean, I also thought, well, I'm writing about a pretty fringy subject. This is not mainstream science. There's still a lot of stigma attached to psychedelics, held over from the 60s. Still people who immediately go to the scare stories that were around in the 60s, people, thinking they could fly and jumping off of buildings. Not that that never happened, it probably did happen a few times. But a whole lot of misconceptions and stigma attached. So I was surprised that after the initial wave of publicity, where the mainstream media was incredibly careful, I remember going on a CBS morning show, and it seemed like very friendly. They, we talked a lot about risk at the beginning, but then it was a good conversation. Then I saw it on YouTube, and around my head were all these warnings that had been added by the TV network about don't try this at home, and these drugs can be dangerous. And I mean, it was just, but that went away. And I found that I was able to engage the mainstream media in a really productive conversation. And over time, you heard a lot less about the scare stories. And it seems to have licensed a lot of people who had psychedelic experiences to kind of come out of the closet and talk about them. And this includes scientists and no politicians yet, but scientists and writers and artists and stuff. So I've seen, and I certainly don't take credit for this because I think that the research that's going on has as much to do with it as this book. I've seen a real change in the US in public attitudes towards psychedelics. I've seen scientists who told me, I would ask them, why aren't you working on this? People doing, say, a psychologist friend who's an emotion researcher and quite prominent. I said, why aren't you? And he studies awe. And I said, well, you got to write about psychedelics. If you're going to study awe, there has to be a chapter in your book on that. And he said, no, it's too risky. Well, now he's doing a chapter on awe, on psychedelics. So I think there is a mainstreaming going on, and I think that's exciting because it means that a lot of really good minds will be working on psychedelics, both therapeutically and in terms of basic science, all of which say we'll know a lot more in 5 years. So, so it, and the pushback that I expected from mainstream psychiatric organizations, the mental health community, that never came. And that's really where I thought it would come. But I learned something I didn't know when I started out, which is that mental health care in the United States, and I'm guessing here as well, is just so broken that, and the tools that they have, the drugs that they have are so poor and losing effectiveness, and people don't like taking them, and the side effects are awful, and they're hard to get off, that there is a kind of openness to innovation, and they see psychedelics as potentially innovative, and God knows they need some new tools. So even that world has been more open than I thought. To the extent I got pushback, it was from people who thought I didn't take seriously the ideas of transpersonal consciousness that come up in psychedelics, and I've been encouraged to take a harder look at that, which I will do.
That's good to know. That being one of my areas of research,
yes.
Of course. Before we move on to that, I was curious to know, so how did your existing readership respond to the book, presuming?
Yeah, it turns out foodies and psychonauts have a lot of overlap.
Okay.
There was this very funny moment where after I published, not the book, but this article that started me in the New Yorker called The Trip Treatment, that was my first foray. I was at the farmer's market in Berkeley, where I live, and this woman who sells this beautiful citrus, mandarins and oranges from Ojai, California. She's there every winter. She beckons me over as I'm walking down the lane between the stalls, and she says, you can get psilocybin at this market too. I knew then I was okay.
So instead of
but it's health, I didn't fully appreciate this. In my head, there were commonalities. I mean, these are things we take into our bodies that change us. They're products of the plant world or the fungal world, and they're one of the things that other species have learned how to do to get us to take care of them and give them habitat and spread them around the world. And so it's not so different than food or beauty, the other things that plants have figured out we like and will gratify our desires for them to get ahead. So, and then it's all about health. I mean, I've been writing about health in the diet, and this, of course, is very much about mental health. So there was more continuity even than I appreciated.
That's a good jumping off point, actually, and I think we kind of delved into this a little bit in our previous talk about how, I mean, you've written in the Botany of Desire and so on, how more often than not, it's we kind of manipulate plants for our own ends, but it's a two-way interaction, and it may be more in their favour often than not. How do you think psychedelics may be manipulating us to their own ends?
Well, it's a bit of a mystery exactly why the psilocybe mushrooms produce psilocybin and psilocin. The assumption usually with these secondary metabolites, these chemicals that the plant doesn't need for its basic respiration and metabolism, is that it's a defense chemical. The question about that with regard to psilocybes is that it appears only in the fruiting body and it doesn't appear underground, which is really where the organism is. The fruiting body is dispensable. It may be defending the mushroom while it's growing till it opens up. That's a possibility. But the latest theory, and this was published after the book came out, so I wasn't able to include it, is that the mushrooms compete with insects for the same food source, which is rotting plant material. And that by producing the chemical, it may advantage them in that competition by kind of screwing with the minds of the insects they're competing with, causing the insects, for example, to lose their appetite. Psychedelics, do not make you hungry. So maybe that's what it is. And it's an interesting thing, though, in general about defense chemicals. Many of them are psychoactive in the right dose. And the question is why? Why go to the trouble of making this complicated molecule that screws with mammal brains or insect brains? And one theory is that if you have a really strong defense chemical and you're just going to kill whatever comes along, you're going to select for resistance really quickly. Whereas if you have a chemical that just makes the insect or the mammal forget what it's doing or where it is, or makes it reckless in a way that it's more likely to be seen and killed by a bird, that's a much better strategy. It's a much more sustainable strategy. And my insight into this came when I was writing Botany of Desire. I had a garden, a fenced-in garden, and I had a cat named Frank, and I planted catnip for Frank. And every night when I was going to harvest in the summer from the garden, he would follow me down into the garden for his cocktail. And but every night he looked at me to remind him where the catnip was. He had forgotten it. And because he would roll in it and get completely fucked up, and then forget where he had this experience. So this is in the realm of speculation. I hasten to add, but it seems to me that messing with the mind of the predator might be smarter than trying to kill it outright.
There is an adage, isn't there? Only users lose drugs, or something like that. Goes along with that. Wonderful. I think so. I mean, if you're kind of taking it into the more transpersonal realms, perhaps, so Paul Stamets, who you probably very well know, would say that the advantage to the fungi or plants for making these secondary compounds is more direct in that they're kind of telling us, wake up, you're screwing up the planet, basically. Wake up, you monkeys.
Right. It's a message from nature, and they're messengers from nature, alerting us or hectoring us to. Because one of the interesting effects of psychedelics, and this has been tested by the crew at Imperial College, is that it does shift people's sense of connectedness to the natural world. The psychologists have a nature connectedness scale, as they have a scale for everything, and your scores, and this measures how much you feel part of nature or apart from nature. I mean, humans have a very weird relationship to nature. We're the only species that has a relationship to nature. We're not just in it, or so we think. And that score goes up after a single psychedelic experience, and I think that's curious. So. It's very common because you're feeling connected. You're feeling very connected, and one of the things depending on the set and setting, you may feel very connected to nature. So, it in a sense, but I see that as kind of more metaphorical than literal, and I don't know how you would prove such an idea, but it's a conceit, but it has a rightness to it.
It's certainly difficult to prove. I mean, that's kind of my area of research, getting into the transpersonal realms. I have also done some survey work looking at people who've taken psychedelics and how their experiences have influenced their kind of ecological consciousness. And of course, it's quite well established, actually. To a large degree, a lot of people taking psychedelics makes them more concerned for nature, more connected to nature. But also, a lot of people have transpersonal experiences of actually communicating directly. So 70% of people in one of my surveys who'd taken ayahuasca said they'd spoken to the spirit of the ayahuasca itself, whatever that means. So.
Yeah, well, I had those experiences too. I just don't know whether to credit them or not. So I had an experience on psilocybin where this book is a work of participatory journalism as well as an account of the science, and in which I was in my garden in New England, and I had written, as you mentioned about Botany Desire, I'd written very much about how plants, that it's a two-way relationship, and plants work on us too. In coevolution takes two, and each species is changing the other in certain ways, and that the subtitle of the book is A Plant's Eye View of the World. And I had this, and that was kind of an intellectual idea in the book, but I had an experience in my garden where all the plants were conscious. And that they were returning my gaze, and I felt their beings. I hesitate to say personality, but they were more alive than they had ever been, and they were completely benign. They liked me. Of course, I had planted them and taken good care of them for many years. But I didn't know what to do with that when I came back to Earth. And on ayahuasca too, I had experiences that felt like messages, although I had a little trouble interpreting them. There was one moment. This is kind of a visual koan I still think about a lot. But on this ayahuasca journey, it wasn't at night for various reasons. The shaman was losing her vision, and so she did these ceremonies during the day. So we were all wearing eye shades. And I was wearing an eye shade that was tight, and it had these three straps around it, and it was tight around my head. And as this journey evolved, they came to feel like bars, and gradually the bars kept moving down my body until I was encased in this very tight, claustrophobic cage. It was very unpleasant. And then at a certain moment, and I didn't know how I could get out, and I looked down at my feet, and I saw a little shoot, and it was a two-leaf beginning of a vine. And I watched the vine curl up, using the bars to rise toward the sun, and then going out at the top. And I kept saying to myself, only animals can be caged, plants can't be caged. And I wrote this in the book. I really can't interpret it very well, but it's a powerful image that I've thought about a lot. And people have written in with their interpretations, that, well, you're the plant, actually, and psychedelics freed you from the cage of rationality, things like that. So I'm agnostic on some of these things. It's very hard to know how to interpret them.
That's a very good position to take, I think, agnosticism. Staying with the kind of ecodelia theme, though, I think, so I was having a conversation, I was giving a talk the other night, and having done this research on people, how psychedelics make them more tuned in with the ecology and so on. Given that we're in the kind of sixth mass extinction and potential climate chaos and all the rest of it, might there be a role, do you think, for, and the question maybe answers it itself, but might there be a role in psychedelics in helping deal with kind of existential crisis related to our current ecological situation?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question, and I have given it some thought. I mean, it's striking to me that these medicines address two of the biggest crises I think we face. One is the environmental crisis, perhaps the biggest, but they also address another crisis, which is tribalism, the rise of racism and intolerance and that we see in the world, and they do it in an interesting way. I think it's in both cases connected to the experience of ego softening or ego dissolution that happens. And it is our egos that builds these walls that allows us to objectify the natural world and to objectify other people as well. It's the same phenomenon, basically. Turn toward other people or turn toward the natural world. And the ego objectifying is very powerful. It allows you to exploit things, right? Put them to utilitarian purposes, your own. When the ego dissolves on psychedelics, there is these walls come down. There is no distinction between subject and object. You feel the subjectivity of the other in a way you don't, including other plants and other species, and other people, of course. You have these very powerful feelings of connection to people who aren't like yourself. So in a way, it seems like exactly the right drug for what ails us. However, how do you go about prescribing a medicine to a whole civilization? That's where we run into trouble. And we had this debate in the 50s and 60s too. Aldous Huxley was a firm believer that the way you do this, and everybody then too believed that this was an important medicine for culture. So some people believed it took this kind of elitist approach, or that you should offer the medicine to influencers. And Al Hubbard, too, is a character in the book, was another less well-known character, but very important person in psychedelic history. And their idea was give it to the artists, give it to the religious figures, give it to the politicians, give it to the businessmen, and they did that. Several of the evangelists in the 50s. And then you get to Timothy Leary and King Kesey, the counterculture figures in America, and they were populists, if you will, or more democratic, and they wanted to give it to everybody. And Leary had even done these calculations on how many Americans he would have to trip before you could blow the mind of the country. And he calculated it at 4 million people. In the event, 2 million people used LSD and psilocybin in the 60s, and it did blow the mind of America. So maybe he was overestimating. But I just don't see a way to do that. That wouldn't spark backlash, that wouldn't be impractical. I mean, this is not fluoride. We're not going to put this in the water. And I've been told by scientists that even if we did, the chlorine would destroy it.
So you've thought about it at least.
I've taken it that far.
I mean, personally, I'm not sure necessarily everybody would have to take it. I mean, I think it should also be an issue of consent.
Obviously, yeah.
And I don't necessarily think psychedelics are for everybody either. In the research, you regularly screen out people who have, psychosis or first-degree relatives with psychosis, even though we don't know for certain that it will trigger psychosis. And the epidemiological studies would suggest that we don't have an epidemic of psychosis from people using psychedelics, but it may, trigger in those. It
may trigger. I mean, The thinking is that this is a population that is going to eventually have a psychotic break and a mental disturbance, which could be psychedelics. It could also be the divorce of parents. It could be starting graduate school. I mean, there are these things that set it off typically in people at certain ages. And cannabis and alcohol can do it too.
Yeah.
So it isn't really clear that these are, you should lay the blame at the foot, but it does happen, and it's part of the, the stigma that got attached to psychedelics was the fact that this does occasionally happen.
I mean, but if you think of it on a societal level, it seems like society may even have a kind of psychotic break at some point, given kind of current challenges that we're facing. So I think, there probably is room, I think, for a more democratic use of psychedelics amongst the populace, but not necessarily for everybody.
But I mean, this is never popular, but there are aspects of the elite approach which strike me as worth exploring. Right now there's a trial going on at NYU and Hopkins giving psychedelics, psilocybin, to religious professionals. Kind of burnt out pastors, priests, everybody but imams. They haven't been able to get any imams to participate. The rabbis lined up, apparently. They had tons of rabbis. I've asked the researchers, well, why are you doing this exactly? And some of it is an interest in seeing whether they find evidence of the perennial philosophy, this idea that there's a common core to all religions, and would the imagery be consistent? And I don't know what they found along that. But the other was to kind of rekindle their spirituality, which often, people get burnt out. So I actually think one good use would be, think of these campaigners who have been fighting on things like climate change or extinction, and the burnout and the despair. And it seems to me that one of the interesting quasi-therapeutic uses is for people like that who need to be recharged. It seems to me worthwhile. And then you get
inspired as well.
Inspired, exactly.
Gail Bradbrook, who'll be speaking at Breaking Convention, she'd been on a ayahuasca and an iboga retreat beforehand, and she'd been involved in various activism. But she said she basically received the keys to social change through her psychedelic experiences, which kind of led to the kind of development of Extinction Rebellion. So you can see that as coming directly out of the psychedelic experience.
So I know there's a group of women based in LA who are pretty well-known activists, peace activists in America. And I was invited to a quarterly ayahuasca session they have, and they do it expressly to kind of work on political strategy and figure out where they should be putting their energy and dealing with the frustrations that they confront. So that's an interesting application. And then, of course, the other elite suggestion you hear all the time is, shouldn't Trump have a trip? This is a very popular meme in America. But I don't think that would work for a couple reasons. I think you have to want it to work. I think you have to have the intention. And, objectifying the other and nature is his superpower, right? And he wouldn't want to give that up. His egotism is so central to his power. And so then you get into, well, what about dosing him without his permission? But I think I really think that could be a disaster. This man has his...
stable enough.
Yeah, and he has his, he has the nuclear code, so I'm not giving this guy psychedelics.
Just to caught a bit of controversy, Michael, on the kind of the whole elitism thing. I mean, I think you may be at risk of being accused of this. Your recent article in the New York Times caused a bit of a stir within the psychedelic community. And I'm not sure I fully understood either, but it was the kind of distinction perhaps between... So you've written this article in response to the recent decriminalisation vote in Denver on psilocybin. And you said decriminalisation good, but you were kind of a bit concerned about the possibilities of legalisation and taking it down the ballot box route. Could you kind of expand on that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about it. So this was an op-ed that I wrote the day after Denver. It didn't exactly decriminalize. It's still a crime to possess psilocybin in Denver because the voters in one city can't change the state law or the national law, obviously. But it did order the police department to make psilocybin crimes their lowest priority. So in effect, it decriminalized it. And I said that if I lived in Denver and voted there, I would have voted yes. It would be hypocritical for me to say anything else because I have possessed, used, and cultivated psilocybin. But I was I was urging caution about moving to a political campaign right now to legalize psilocybin. Because the basic assumption behind this campaign, which is getting started in the United States, is that we can follow the playbook we did for cannabis. And I think it's a very different case. And I think it's a mistake to conflate those two things. One, at the level of the drug experience, I think it's much more consequential using psychedelics. I think there's greater risk, psychological risk, not physiological risk. And that when you legalize something, and I've seen this because I live in California, when you legalize something, not only do you make it available to people, but it gets pushed on you by large corporations marketing it very aggressively. I mean, when I come home from this trip, I will drive over the Bay Bridge and I'll see 3 giant billboards for cannabis delivery services that will have cannabis at my doorstep in 2 hours. No questions asked. I guess they ask you how old you are. So I have that concern, but it's also not like cannabis in this sense. It was really important to decriminalize or legalize cannabis because it was at the heart of the drug war in America. Without cannabis being criminal, it was very hard to have a drug war. The numbers are just too small. And that's why cannabis is Schedule I, and that's why they went for it, very aggressively for cannabis crimes. The mass incarceration that flowed from the drug war in America that we're now trying to unwind is in large part the result of cannabis being criminal. What happened in America is we passed all these 3 strikes laws that if you had 3 felonies, you would go to jail for a ridiculously long amount of time. And very often, at least one of those strikes was a cannabis crime. So cannabis there was a huge social justice problem here that had to be addressed, and one way to address it was by legalizing cannabis and emptying the jails of people who had cannabis convictions. Is there such a problem with psilocybin? Most people who want psilocybin are obtaining it, they're not being arrested. So I think the risk of going this political route right now, at a time when the drugs are working their way through the federal approval process, the FDA approval process, there have been no obstacles put in the way. The FDA is being very encouraging. The process hasn't been political. That we could risk that and that process by having a big political debate now about psilocybin. And that's kind of what the point I was trying to make. When in politics, you have to not only choose your fight, but you have to choose when to fight it. And I don't think this is the right moment. I think we're getting green lights on medical, approval as a medicine. That's true, that won't necessarily help everybody else, and we do have to address that. But I think it'll be easier to address once it is approved as a medicine. So my take was, let's not rush. Now there's another ballot initiative that's coming in Oregon, the state of Oregon, which is very progressive on drug policy and many policies. It's more Californian than California in some ways, that would legalize guided psychedelic therapy and provide for a whole regime of training of guides and licensing of guides by the state. That's interesting. I'm not sure what I think about it yet, to be honest. It may have the same kind of risk. But it's telling a different story about psychedelics than mere legalization, which is that these are, profound experiences, somewhat risky experiences. Maybe you want a guide involved, that it will need to be regulated in some way. And where we are, I think, or where we're getting as a society is trying to figure out what's the proper container to put these powerful medicines in. We have a medical container that's been evolved that seems to work pretty well. We have very promising research coming out of Imperial College and NYU and Johns Hopkins, and many other universities are about to start this work. So we know about that container. It's the guided trip where you're prepared very carefully, usually by 2 guides. They sit with you during the experience and they help you make sense of it after. And they're available if any adverse events happen. And then we have this religious container which also seems to work pretty well. We have 2 ayahuasca churches in America that can legally use ayahuasca under, they have a constitutional right under separation of church and state, and you have the Native American Church, which has the right to use peyote in their ceremonies, again, assured by Congress and the Supreme Court. So that's it. So you have a religious container, a medical container, and then there is the rest of us. And we haven't yet figured out what that container is. And it's going to look a little bit like both of them, probably. But I think we need to figure that out before we legalize it.
It certainly, probably needs something at least for the status quo to shift in an appropriate way, I would say. I mean, for instance, treating it like a dangerous sport. It's not that dangerous relative to horse riding, though, perhaps.
Rock climbing.
Yeah, but you wouldn't buy a paraglider and just jump off the top of a cliff with it. You'd probably want to sit down with some people and have a few kind of test flights.
Of course, legally you can jump off the cliff.
You can,
right.
but it's kind of regulated from within. It's advisable to join a club and have a bit of training first before you take the plunge. So,
but it doesn't necessarily have to be the government, of course.
No,
you could.
Not.
I mean, you can think of it more like organic certification or soil association certification.
Exactly.
I mean, that there's a civil society organization that kind of works this out. I think they're really interesting questions. I think it's one of the more important cultural projects of the next few years is figuring this out. When the drugs got here in the 50s and 60s, they didn't come with an instruction manual. And we weren't that aware of the ancient uses of the drugs at the time. And they were used, it was anything goes. It was a free-for-all. And some people had great experiences and some people had horrible experiences. There was some very reckless use. There were, people did things like put psychedelics in the punch bowl, and they thought that was a cool idea. I think we now know that that's probably a cruel thing to do. So we're still learning, but the lesson we can take, I think, from the ancient use of these drugs, if you look at all the cultures for thousands of years have used psychedelics in their religion or in their healing, you see a few common threads. One is that there's usually, you seldom take them alone. The shamans sometimes do, but normally it's done in a group setting. There's always an elder of some kind, a shaman, a curandera, a healer of some kind, a roadman in the peyote cult. It's usually done on special occasions, not casually at all, with quite a bit of ceremony. And I think all those, there's wisdom in all that. That was all figured out by trial and error. And so I think that there's, we should plumb that wisdom too.
I totally agree. Thank you for clarifying that point, because I'm not sure if that necessarily came across in the article. Or
well, some of it is the way the headlines. The headline is always simplifies your argument. I wasn't happy with the headline. I forget what it was, but go slow on psychedelics, and then something we're not ready. I forgot.
I think it totally clarifies it, and I think it was kind of implicit, but maybe not explicit. And but people have kind of made their own mind about it.
Yeah, and frankly, I have grown more cautious the more I've the last year of talking about this, because I've heard some horrible stories. I mean, people have come to tell me, people who have a child who had a psychotic break on LSD or psilocybin, and or stories of sexual abuse that I've heard in guiding relationships. And so it's definitely made me more cautious. And these stories end up on my doorstep now.
Absolutely. I'm glad to say that your concern was with the pharmaceutical takeover as well. I mean, I think we should also be somewhat wary of that. I mean, this building on the other side of this quad is this beautiful painted hall, and below it they've just done some excavations and renovations, and they found some of the old monastery, which is part of the palace underneath, and they've reopened it, and it's now sponsored by the Sacklers, so it's the Sackler Gallery, which, if you know anything about the Sacklers, they've just become one of the richest families in the States from their sale of OxyContin, thank you, which is kind of partly responsible for tens of thousands of deaths of people in the States addicted to opiates. So
yeah, they marketed the drug very aggressively, and marketed on the basis that it was not addictive when they knew better. So that's what I mean about drugs being pushed on people once they, legalization doesn't solve all your problems. The opiate crisis in America, and it is, I don't use that word lightly, it's I think 75,000 people in 1 year overdosed on opiates in America. That it is...
Prescription opiates.
Prescription opiates. Well, no, they weren't all. I mean, some of them start on prescription opiates and then look for it elsewhere and end up with fentanyl and things like that. But it just shows you can have a drug crisis after you've legalized drugs.
Yeah.
So,
Fortunately, psychedelics, the classic ones at least, are not addictive, and I would know I've taken them thousands of times.
Make your own judgment.
A bit of self-disclosure. Maybe we should open it up to the audience for any comments or questions.
Yeah, I'd love to hear your questions.
Yes. Actually, I just don't know what you mean, but there's a bit of a thing where whenever you kind of open it up to questions, there's always the first people to put their hands up are men. And so I'd like just to see if any women, first of all, would like to ask a question. Thank you.
Well, I just wanted to ask, no matter what container you put it in, isn't that going to create a system of gatekeepers? Isn't that going to keep it away from people who really need it, but who can't afford it, who can't afford to go through the bureaucracy or whatever system they need to, all the hoops that they need to jump through to get access to it?
Well, yeah, but that's an argument for going down the medical path, right? I mean, if these trials prove that this is an effective treatment for depression, addiction, obsessive compulsive disorder, it will be covered by health insurance. And so, in a way, that's the most democratic way to go about it. I think the private use is, obviously people have to pay their own way. When you regulate, I don't know that we need to require guides, but if we do, yes, that will drive up the price. But I think people who qualify for a medical diagnosis will have access to it, as long as you have national health.
I guess that's a different question.
This gentleman, and then us.
I actually identify as a woman.
Can you speak up a bit?
I actually identify as a woman.
Thank you. That's fine. That's completely fine. I didn't know that. But you go for it.
Touche.
In the book, you mentioned, I think it might have been on your LSD trip, where you're looking at the trees in your garden and projecting your mother and father onto those trees. I just wanted to know, since writing the book, if you've done any further exploration into your own psychology and how you fit into your family.
Yeah, it was on psilocybin, that trip, and that was an unguided trip. The one I was describing in my garden, I ended up walking down this garden path and ending up in this building that I had built where I used to, we don't live there anymore, but it's where I wrote several of my books. It's a little cabin in it, and it looks back toward the house. It's about 100 yards back, and there are two trees. And the view, I sited it so that there's a tree on each side. And I had this very powerful epiphany on this psilocybin trip that these trees were my parents, and that one was a very elegant white oak that had these, it was kind of at an angle, and my mom's a little bit at an angle now. She is sort of osteoporosis on one side. And very long arms that reached, like a dancer up into space. And that was clearly my mother. And then there was this other one, which was this kind of more stout ash tree that had broken limbs. And my dad had cancer and had all these problems. And it was just absolutely clear as day that these were my parents. Something happened later and it happened after the book was done. But well, two things happened. One is my dad died, and shortly before he died, one of the trees fell down in a storm. But it wasn't his tree. It was the other one. It was the oak. And it was the most, when a great tree on your property falls, it's always a trauma. But this was of a different order. So a lot of my experiences, and the LSD trip you're alluding to, was very much about family. And I found myself, and was not a heroic dose of LSD by any means, but I found myself thinking about my relationships and going through the different people in my life, and they were present to me, and feeling these, you know, powerful like surges of love toward them. And so yeah, my family's been a big part of it. My son, my wife, my parents, my sisters. And it's been an opportunity to think about people you take for granted. One of the things psychedelics do is you don't take anything for granted. And that has enormous value therapeutically. I mean, even if you're just doing it by yourself. It's hard to write about. You know, one of the things I really struggle at, that a lot of the epiphanies you have are really banal on psychedelics, but they're also profound. You know, the idea that love is the most important thing in the universe. This is like a very common perception on psychedelics. And it sounds like a Hallmark card, but it happens to be true. And we cloak sentiment in so much irony. And it's a protective thing. I think it's our egos in a way, protecting us from strong feelings. And that all gets scraped away. And these are very naked emotions. But how do you write about them without them sounding like, you know, Hallmark cards? That was a struggle.
I love the other point you made last time we spoke about the ineffability of the experiences as well. And you described your 5-MeO DMT experience and how you restrict all the usual reference points for telling a story.
Right.
You know, that you lost sense of time and suspense.
I had no self. This was a horrible experience on 5-MeO DMT. And it was just an experience of pure mental chaos. I'm just a Category 5 mental hurricane in my mind, but my mind could not be separated from the whole universe. And there was no self, which I had experienced already and I could deal with, but there was also no time, no space, no matter, nothing but energy. And how do you tell a story without those three ingredients of, you know, time, space, and character? Hard to do narrative without those. So yeah, that was the struggle. I mean, the whole writing issue the book was a very interesting challenge as a writer, because, you know, we've all read bad trip reports, I'm sure. Arrowwood is full of them, and it's like, you know, when someone tells you their dreams, you want to run in the other direction, and usually. And so how was I going to write about these experiences that were so profound to me but might not be to somebody else? And it took me a long time to figure out how to F the ineffable. And, you know, you have to judge for yourself whether I got it right. But I figured out a kind of technique that worked for me. It's not the same way Aldous Huxley did it. I mean, he did it brilliantly, I think. And his account has influenced everybody who's come later. But for me, I teach writing, and I was teaching a course on the memoir, and I was reading a lot of memoirs, and I noticed that the really good ones had two voices in them usually. They had the kind of childhood voice, if they were a memoir of childhood, that they kind of evoked the 10-year-old self, but then they would go to the adult self and the perspectives of the adult self. And so you had the vividness of the child perspective, and then you had the wisdom of the adult self, or the person who had stepped away from that life, and that friction between those two perspectives is really what makes them good, I think, very often. And too much on one side or the other, and it's really dull. And so I thought, could I do something like that with psychedelics? And not in time so much, but inside and outside the experience. So you'll see I shuttle back and forth. And when I get to, and I felt this, you know, I realized that love is the most important principle in the universe, I stopped and talked about that problem and banality. I kind of break the fourth wall and talk to the audience, just very directly about the problem I'm having with this. Or, I know how crazy this sounds just now, because I'm not writing for psychonauts. I mean, I'm writing for them, but also for people who perhaps never had this experience. And I really wanted to bring them in. And so, you know, well, see for yourself if you think it works. But it was once I hit on that technique or trick, I had great fun writing about it. It was the most fun I've ever had as a writer, because, I mean, it's wild material. And as a journalist, usually confined to this tight box of checkable facts, here I was writing about the pure products of my imagination. And I felt, as I imagine a novelist does, you know, writing down this waking dream that is the plot or story or characters and dialogue. So it was great fun.
Thank you. There was a question here, Mouse, and then thank you.
My question, what it is going back to the politicians and what's his name, Trump, psychedelics. What's his name? Oh yeah, psychedelics. It's too much for them. But what are your thoughts on MDMA? Because it might not give you the feeling of connectedness as much, but it gives you that feeling of empathy and caring about other humans without freaking them out, having hallucinogenics. I think if the world was, dropped MDMA, like proper good stuff,
in the water.
Everyone had it in their cornflakes every day. Surely that would be a start. And then they might be more open to psychedelics.
Well,
but it's less, but it's still got that feeling of caring, empathy, connectedness,
I think it could make a valuable contribution. Rick Doblin, the head of MAPS, who I see as co-sponsor of Breaking Convention, or one of the sponsors, he, in the late 80s, was sending hundreds of doses of MDMA to the arms negotiators in the Soviet Union. And guess what? We got arms control. Now, did they take it? Did they receive it? I have no idea. But he had exactly that impulse. And he also sent it to a bunch of UN representatives. I mean, this was his mission in the late 80s, was to give as many people MDMA as possible.
I think there's a bit of an unwritten history as well yet to come to light about the role of MDMA in the rave culture and how that affected the situation in Northern Ireland with the Troubles, and also had a contributory factor to reduction of football hooliganism as well. I think
really, that history needs to be written.
Big time. I know actually some football hooligans told me how it changed completely. Instead of beating each other up, they were hugging each other. And it went on for a long time until they discovered that. I mean, the government were like, and invented alcohol pops to get them back on the alcohol as early as possible, to keep them away from the drugs that woke them up. I think that's my personal.
I was recently I kind of missed the rave culture. I don't know where I was or what I was doing, but it wasn't as big in the U.S. But one of the psychedelic pioneers, who I write about in the book, a man named Bob Jesse, who really did a lot to launch the research, and he was a tech entrepreneur or tech executive, and had some powerful psychedelic experiences and got very interested in the spiritual implications of psychedelics. His other interest, and got the work started at Johns Hopkins, which really launches the renaissance of research. His other interest was ecstatic dance. And he founded what he calls a church. It's called the Rhythm Society in the Bay Area. And they meet quarterly on the equinox and whatever the other thing is, and they dance, and 500 strong or even more, and all different ages, and it's the same group, but you can bring guests. And I hadn't been in an event; it was an all-night dance and it was clear that there was a lot of MDMA being used, although everybody was very discreet about it. But there was no alcohol. No alcohol was permitted. And no, you don't. But it just, I hadn't been at a late night thing without alcohol, I realized, and how sloppy and grabby and aggressive people get. And people just were kind of in a good headspace till 6 a.m. It was the most remarkable thing. Many of you this may not be news to many of you, but it certainly was to me.
So a question here and then behind you.
I'm just wondering if you, what seems to go quite hand in hand with the psychedelics in the literature when you read around it is things like meditation and non-dual states in that, but also psychoanalysis in its depth of things like psychosynthesis and Jung, and also isolation patterns. And there seems to be some kind of definitely similarity of effect with psychedelics. And I wonder if you had any thoughts on that actual similarity of effect?
I do. I haven't. I don't know a lot about isolation tanks, but people have suggested I look into that. And these are tanks where you're getting no sensory input, not light, not temperature, even because it's body temperature. And people begin to, the mind is interesting. When it's not getting information, it starts sending out and creating information, and so people often do hallucinate. The links with meditation, I think, are fascinating, and there's a lot more to be learned there, but one of the most striking findings, I think, in the research has been when at Imperial College they began imaging the brains of people on psilocybin and LSD. They found that there was this suppression of activity in this one particular brain network, the default mode network, which is implicated in many functions we associate with the creation of a sense of self or ego. Time travel, self-reflection, theory of mind, all these kind of things. And after Robin Carhart Harris published that paper, a researcher at Yale named Judson Brewer, who was doing similar scans of the brains of very experienced meditators, 10,000 hours or more, he would put them in the scanner and ask them to meditate. And the scans looked almost identical. The same networks were being deactivated. And it's sort of stands to reason, because in both cases there is this transcendence of self. So that I thought that was very interesting, and I went and interviewed Judson Brewer in the book. And when he saw that, he went down to Johns Hopkins, and he was an experienced meditator, and he participated in some of their trials, taking psychedelics, I think, for the first time. And he said that he could imagine a time when people would use meditation, psychedelics, to kickstart a meditation practice. That it gives you a kind of trailer or preview of the kind of consciousness perhaps you're trying to evolve to. Non-egoic, a lot of kind of just acceptance of whatever's coming through your head. And I think that makes a lot of sense. In America, the arrival of Buddhism in America, which really happens in the 70s and 80s with people like Jack Kornfield and Joan Halifax and John Kabat-Zinn, I interviewed them all for the book, and they all started with psychedelics. There would not be Buddhism in America. I can't speak for England, but there would not be Buddhism in America without psychedelics. And many of them turned away from it. It got them started, and they were looking for a way to have a daily practice, which you can't do with psychedelics. And they found their way to Buddhism. And of course, Ram Dass found his way to Hinduism. And so I think there's a really natural progression. And in my own experience, I found the way to kind of cultivate what I had learned and the kinds of consciousness I had tasted was through meditation. And I became a much happier meditator after my psychedelic experience. So I think that's a very rich area. And I think a lot of the psychedelic research is confirming Buddhist ideas about the mind. So thanks for your question.
And with breath work, can you experience similar kind of
Yes. So breath work, thanks for bringing that up. So holotropic breath work is a breathing exercise that was developed by Stanislav Grof, who is one of the pioneering psychedelic psychiatrists, Czech emigre working in California. First in Maryland, then California. When the drugs were made illegal, he was having such success in his basically psychoanalysis practice using LSD that he wanted to find an alternative. So drawing on various indigenous traditions, yogic breathing and drumming, Native American drumming, and I don't know what else, he developed this practice that it's the most uncanny thing, because I did experience it, where you practice this kind of breathing, which is very rapid, stronger exhale than inhale. I think you hyperventilate eventually to the sound of a very rhythmic music. And within a few minutes, it doesn't work for everybody, but it works for a majority of people, you are in a trance state that has a lot of the tone of psychedelics. I mean, you do see images. I felt like I was riding a horse through a forest for this whole time, and I was moving, and I couldn't control the movements of my hands or my legs. I was like dancing on my back, and it was remarkable, and it was just one of those insights as to how close other states of consciousness are to our everyday waking consciousness, and that you can, that something as simple as breathing can slip you through the curtain into the other one. So,
but I think that the door is open, with psychedelics before, as you kind of said before, and then when you do find other techniques to experience similar things, then you have those images, and it sort of opens up something kind of experience.
I think having had a psychedelic experience, I'll bet breathwork is more successful. Ditto meditation, because I agree. Having experienced something once, your mind, you kind of know how to get there.
It's in your cells, almost in your memory of your cells, and then you just open it up again.
Yeah.
Being a good psychologist, we've got some measures for that, and that's actually one of my ongoing research projects is mapping other altered states of consciousness as comparators to psychedelic experiences, such as breath work and flotation tanks, anechoic dark rooms, and so on. And guess what? They seem to be about equivalent to a low to medium dose of psychedelics, generally on paper by our crude psychological measures, which you're so far.
So you're asking phenomenological questions?
Yes, but in a kind of quantified way. So kind of like the mystical experience scale, those kind of.
And any other ones you're working with? Do you do hypnosis?
Not yet, but plan to do that. So we've got a kind of standardised kind of dosage, kind of equivalency for different altered states, in a generic way.
Oh, that's fascinating.
There was a question here when we kind of kindly waited.
I just want to say a couple of things. That about 10 years ago, we were able to sell psychedelic mushrooms for about 5 years.
In England?
In shoe shops and Chinese takeaways.
For years. We sold them for years, for about 5 years, and it didn't cause particular problems, and it was noticeable.
So was it legal or just?
It was a legal loophole in that fresh mushrooms hadn't fallen under the explanation of what constituted a drug. So you couldn't sell dried ones because they were prepared, but fresh ones you could. And they started selling them on pretty much every shop on Oxford Street.
Really, shoe shops?
Shoe shops,
why
Chinese
shoe shops?
Takeaways, just because they were making money out of it.
Well, I don't know about the shoe shops.
The shoe shops, I saw them in shoe shops. Of course.
There's that happened.
And of course, this was true in Amsterdam too, for years. I mean, they still can sell the truffles, but one case a suicide that the authorities said was connected to psilocybin, and they changed the law.
So what I'm saying is that, and then what I was going to say, as well as that, is parallel. Not parallel, really, is that fact that we have psilocybin growing naturally every season for years, and so that has been a common, for many communities, that's something that happens.
Yeah, there are many parts of America too where people go out and gather their own mushrooms.
And so that's something that happens, and obviously people do connect with the earth at that point, because you're not going to a shop and you're not going to a...
Right, no money changes hands.
You're doing that thing, and then that becomes its own...
Yeah, and I don't think that should be illegal. I really don't. I mean, in general, I mean, I am a libertarian on drugs. I mean, I just think it's, and I think one of the problems with prohibition is you can't regulate it if you want to regulate it, to make sure that something is what it says it is, for example, which is very important with MDMA, for example.
What's interesting about this is obviously that then you start to have a conversation about what's going on there, and what's really interesting, and those sort of are about relationships with self.
I see, and
ever form in your community, with the planet,
right.
different altered states as well. So it's like, and I think that what we've slightly missed, especially because the ultimate sort of probable experience of self is when you die, and there's a possibility that through spirit or through some experiences like this, or us being allowed to learn how to have a relationship with self and therefore better relationships with others.
Look, I think some of the most important work being done with psychedelics is the experiments that were done in America giving psilocybin to people who had cancer, and many of whom were terminal. And that the conversations I had with those volunteers were the most open, frank conversations about death I've ever had with anyone. And these were with people who were right up against, confronting their mortality. And I think the potential, I think that is the most powerful application. And I regret that no one's working on it right now, because everybody is focused on depression. And depression is a huge problem, and it was because they saw this strong signal in those trials that it did reduce depression. However, the depression of someone who's dying may be a very special thing. It's recent, it has a cause, so it may not work as well, actually, with major depression or treatment-resistant depression. We'll see. But I think for the first time we have something, or the first time since religion, that we have something we can offer people who are in that existential crisis. And I think that that's enormously important, and it should be made available to people as soon as we can.
I'm patiently waiting here. A question?
Thank you, Michael. I really enjoyed listening to you this evening. What are your next steps, and what do you view your mission as in this world of psychedelics?
It's funny as a journalist when there's a moment where sometimes you turn into an advocate. I'm postponing that as long as I can, because you lose your ability to do reporting, which is really the heart and soul of what I do. With food, I wrote a couple books before I became an advocate. At a certain point, I knew exactly what I thought. I knew what agricultural policy should be. It would have been disingenuous for me to pretend I didn't have an opinion, and that's, of course, what journalism encourages you to pretend. But here, the only thing I'm sure of, and that I am willing to advocate for, is that we do this research. That it go forward, that we learn everything we can from these remarkable molecules, and that the funding appears, and I've worked to raise money for research, and that we put no obstacles in the way, because I think it's that important. For reasons having to do with dealing with the mental health crisis we face. I mean, there is, we have a huge problem around mental health, and here we have a potential medicines that could revolutionize mental health care. Beyond that, I'm still learning. This guy has 1,000 trips. I have like 10, so I have a long way to go. And now that I'm so out of the closet about it, I actually can't do anything now. I mean, I have to be very careful. So I'm still learning. This is the book of a newcomer. I'm a newbie in this book. I'm a reluctant psychonaut. I was very afraid, and I convinced myself that was a virtue, not that yes, there are people much more experienced than I am, but by doing it for the first time, I had a perspective that a more experienced psychonaut might not have. I mean, you only have a first time once, and there's a quality of wonder and awe that you have that's special. So I thought I could use my naivete in a productive way in this book. I'm less naive, but I still have a long way to go.
So I've just had a kind of a message in. I feel like newsreaders here at the desk. There's some kind of news come in that the books have arrived.
Oh wow!
And they're on the way over. So we're just going to kind of just like filter it out for like maybe one last good question until the books arrive. Yes,
So I'm curious what was your sort of circumstances behind your calling from psychedelics, and what was the first substance?
What was?
And there's a second part, which is which one is the one that you're most looking forward to repeating? I'm guessing.
What was it called?
Yes. So the first one I did was mushrooms. And I had the privilege of going mushroom hunting with Paul Stamets. And there is a variety of, there are 150 different psilocybes. We use 1 or 2 or 3 maybe, typically. But there's one that called psilocybe azurescens that, in fact, he named and discovered is the most powerful, the strongest one there is. And he took me hunting for it at, I can't be too precise, but near the mouth of the Columbia River, which is the only place it's been found. It's called azurescens because his son is named Azurius. However, his son was named for the color of psilocybin, so it's kind of this naughty etymology. And we found some, not a lot, but enough. And so my first big experience was the one I described in my garden, and with my parents turning into trees, was on that. I feel like very comfortable with psilocybin. 5-MeO-DMT I would say was my least favorite. LSD, I felt like I had, for complicated reasons I explained in the book, I had a kind of a middling dose, and it was absolutely fine, and I sort of feel like that remains to be explored further. But again, I don't want to jeopardize. My concern in publishing this book was not that I would get arrested. I understood how to make these confessions legally useless, which, in case you want to know, hide when it happened and where it happened. Everything else, then you don't have a usable confession. And there's a statute of limitations. But I shouldn't give any advice on English law, so I just realized I have no idea how it works here. Look it up. But it's my guides, the people I work with. I was very concerned that maybe some eager, prosecutor would want to make an example of one of them and use me or somehow, that connection, my relationship to them, to track them down and go after them. So I've kept my distance from the guides so as not to jeopardize them in any way, just in case anybody is investigating this. So far, there's been no legal ramifications, but to the extent that we're having a renaissance in the use of psychedelics as well as the research, it's sooner or later some law enforcement entity is going to try to make an example of somebody. So I look forward to the day where they're more accessible in a legal way, and if they were, I think they would be part of my life. I think I can imagine having a psychedelic experience every year on my birthday. I think that'd be a really good way to mark, the passage of another year. But I have to say, I still, even at the end, I still got very nervous before this happened, and never went into it lightly, and had to convince myself, because my ego kept arguing, you don't want to do this. I know why. But the ego is very clever and commands your rational faculties, and it has very good arguments. Fortunately, I defeated them. But one more while we're waiting?
I think the books are actually here. So today on Greenwich News, we had a plant and food journalist who took a number of very potent hallucinogens and had a grade 5 mental storm and discovered that was everything. And now over to Tom for the So that concludes our news report. I think we'll be happy for books. Do we have one more question, or do we have a vote? We'll sign some books.
How are we going to vote if that's the question?
Okay, that was your question. Thank you very much.
Well, you can keep asking me as I'm signing, but thank you for a set of superb questions.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you all for coming along.
Thank you, David. Thank you. Thank you very much.